All right. So my guest today is Alec Karakatsanis. Alec, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
I want to talk a little bit more about your background, but if this is a first introduction for anyone, Alec is the founder of Civil Rights Corps and the author most recently of Copaganda, which I think will take up a good chunk of this conversation. But Alec, I first wanted to ask you what in your life really brought you to the decision to write this book?
I've been working on these issues for many years. I've been a public defender first in Alabama and then in Washington, D.C. And I'd worked both in federal courts, so representing people who couldn't afford an attorney who were accused of federal crimes, and then also representing individuals in local court in Washington, D.C. who couldn't afford an attorney. And so I'd seen kind of a lot of different aspects of the punishment bureaucracy up close. And then I started my career as a civil rights lawyer. I got a grant from Harvard Law School to quit my job as a public defender and start using civil rights laws to try to challenge some of the systemic, everyday injustices and brutalities of the punishment bureaucracy, the things I was seeing in courts and jails and communities across the country. And we had a lot of success by any kind of traditional metric. You know, we were winning lots of civil rights cases. For example, we were winning cases that were striking down the money bail system around the country, where hundreds of thousands of human beings are separated from their families on any given night and jailed in horrific conditions solely because their families can't pay a certain amount of cash to a for-profit company, right? This for-profit money bail industry exists only in the United States and the Philippines. And we were winning those kinds of cases. We were winning many other cases. You know, we were striking down the rise of modern debtors' prisons. You know, I got to the city of Ferguson shortly after Michael Brown was killed and during the uprisings in 2014 and started investigating the Ferguson Police Department and the police departments in dozens of other cities around the St. Louis region and saw the same things I saw throughout the rest of the country on my investigations. For example, the city of Ferguson averaged 3.6 arrest warrants for every household. Unprecedented stuff. I mean, right, and most of these arrest warrants were for unpaid debt, not for criminal activity or anything like that. And so uh, I, we were having all this success, but in city after city, we were coming across many of the same narratives and attitudes and mythologies and the responses of these systems to this incredible corruption and profiteering and brutality was always to find ways to quote unquote reform themselves in ways that only increased their budgets and that sort of found their own violence and corruption as a way to increase their power. And that was my first window into sort of how important it is to think about how we talk about what these systems do, what their purposes are, what their functions are, who they benefit and who they harm. And I started paying much more attention to the way that the mainstream news was talking about our cases and talking about crime and safety more generally. And I became kind of obsessed with what I saw as some extraordinarily misleading ways that the system was talking about what it does and what it doesn't do to the general public. And so I started archiving on social media and in my own files, archiving sort of the media coverage of these systems and started writing about it a little bit. And then there was so much interest in the stuff I was saying and doing that eventually agreed to write a book about it, even though it was hard for me to make the decision to spend my time to write a book, just given how busy we are with our civil rights work. But it felt urgent to me to at least attempt to share some of the things I was seeing and learning with more people.
hmm Well, I'm glad you did. I mean, obviously, the work you're doing with Civil Rights Corps is so important, and it is impressive that you managed to write this book on top of that. But it's a very practical book, and I think it may be most useful for the well-intentioned liberals who may have some, skepticism about police in their neighborhood, or get interested in police misconduct when it breaches national news, but whose good intentions are far too often channeled into bad or unhelpful policy. And you brought up cameras in the book, and you've been talking about that recently. That's a great example where I feel lots of well-intentioned people will end up pushing for quote unquote reforms that are actually items on the agenda of the punishment bureaucracy. Um, I don't know if you feel the same way about the book in that sense, but I feel like it's very eye-opening for that kind of citizen.
Yeah, I think that the main audience of the book is not the far right. It's not people who revel in the violence and brutality that we're seeing now, for example, with ICE. It's anybody else who wants a society where there's less state violence and less violence generally, and more equality and more liberty, and who is interested and well-meaning in the sense that they want, a society where all human beings can flourish, and who are outraged at the violence that they see in our society in any context, and so who start from the premise that all violence is bad, and we have to develop policies and institutions that enable people to live their lives, um, and and to sort of chart the course of their own life, and to have safe places for their children to grow up and to play and to learn, and all of the things that most people say they want, right? Like, this is the audience of the book, because I think there is an incredible and very successful propaganda effort to get ordinary, well-meaning people like that to think that the path toward genuine safety requires unprecedented investment in bureaucracies of repression, in surveillance, in punishment, in human caging, in family separation, in caging and brutal treatment of children, and all of the things that are happening right now, with tremendous profits, I might add, to a number of different multi-billion-dollar industries. These things have been turned into a sort of situation where they're synonymous with quote unquote public safety in our society, even though the vast empirical literature and the available scholarly evidence shows that these repressive bureaucracies actually make us less safe, right? So if more investment in police prosecution and prisons and surveillance made us safer, we'd have the safest society in recorded world history. And we don't. We don't have a very safe society. And the fact of the matter is that the things that are linked to safety are actually like pretty obvious when you look at the research and the literature, and even common sense. It's things like levels of inequality and housing and healthcare and early childhood education and certain types of pollution and certain sort of big features of our culture, including um, toxic masculinity and other forms of sort of social behavior that are linked to levels of loneliness and isolation versus levels of connection and community. Anyway, I could go on and on, but I think the audience for the book is those people who are constantly misled into supporting the wrong solutions
Hmm.
to these really important problems.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I want to talk about some of the wrong solutions and some of the right solutions, but maybe if we can stay at the 30,000-foot level for a moment, I really appreciated your framing of the entire book really as focused on the punishment bureaucracy as a whole instead of any of its constituent parts. And I fear that, or after reading your book, I feel that sometimes the discussion around, ways of policing and maybe helping safety in general do just sort of get waylaid or misled by overly focusing on the constituent parts and not the big picture. But I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that decision to focus and really keep using that term punishment bureaucracy.
Well, I think that there's a lot of ways to approach that question, so I'm happy to approach it differently if it makes more sense to you. But I think my first reaction would be most people get into the weeds too quickly, and don't sort of take a step back to ask like certain like really big picture questions about these systems. So and Ironically, people seem to be able to do this quite well when talking about other countries. So, for example, if you ask people about a country for which there's a lot of American style propaganda, like let's say Russia or Iran or China or Israel or whatever, people are much more readily able to see that the armed government bureaucracies and bureaucracies of surveillance in those countries are instruments that people with power in those other societies are wielding to preserve that power and to increase their own wealth and the wealth of the people in their social circles and professional circles, et cetera, right? So people readily get that in any society, the sort of violent arms of the controlling government factions in that society are going to serve the interests of people who have power in that government, right? They're not under any illusion that the main purpose of like the morality police in Iran or for example, this has been something that pops up in mainstream news a lot over the last few years. They're not under any illusion that the purpose of that is public safety. And in fact, if you look at the early origins of and the same is true, by the way. I'm just using Iran because an example that is sort of heavily propagandized in the United States, but this applies to any nation state, right? Um, the in the early 20th century, the police were much more open about their function and their role. It's only really the second half of the 20th century, the post-World War II kind of Cold War era, that we really start to see an incredible public relations focus in American policing on convincing people that their main purpose is public safety. It used to be much clearer that their main purpose, initially was, to catch enslaved people who had run away in much of the country, and also when they started to professionalize in the rest of the country, it was largely to punish and control striking working class labor movements. They were, deployed and played significant roles in crushing every major progressive social movement, women's suffrage, anti-war movements, et cetera, et cetera. There wasn't a need to propagandize. And so before we get into the weeds of like any particular aspect of the punishment bureaucracy, it's really important to know the history and to think more critically about who benefits from repression generally, and whether it's the prison system or the policing system or the prosecutorial and court system or the surveillance bureaucracies or the authorities that are in the news a lot now, with border and immigration authorities. You ask yourself sort of who benefits from increasing the centralized power of a government to monitor and know what people are doing and to punish them for it. And if you think more critically about those things, you tend to be less susceptible to get into the weeds and to get distracted by a lot of like the daily little discussions about little policy tweaks here and there and little reforms. You start to understand what these systems are really about.
Hmm. Yeah. I feel like, I often, when I think about what ails our society, I often think about it in terms of what is incentivized, and that's why I appreciate you mentioning who benefits from these systems now. And I feel like I would maybe even venture to say a majority of Americans would sort of intuitively understand what's wrong with private and for-profit prisons. But you point out in your book just how many other whole industries profit off of mass incarceration, from the cash bail industry to telecommunications and so much more in between. And I was just kind of, stunned by that the number of structural incentives that push toward mass and increasing incarceration, which was sobering and depressing to think about. I wonder, as you think about the punishment bureaucracy and the system, the constituent systems within that, how much of this is actually conspiracy by interested parties who are incentivized to work together to maintain and expand this, and how much of this is just an emergent property of the way our society is set up?
Well, I think those two things are not necessarily mutually exclusive. I would say, first of all, as a matter of just getting some of the basic facts out there, every people are, I think, rightly appalled, shocked even by the private prison industry. And I think more people are starting to pay attention to that now because the vast bulk of immigration detention, concentration camps, etc., are run privately for profit. But every element of the so-called public prison industrial complex has basically been privatized for profit. So inside public jails and prisons, almost everything is a multi-billion-dollar industry. The phone calls, right? So one of the big areas of cases that we've developed over the last couple of years is we are representing children across the United States because millions of children every year are now barred from even visiting, holding the hand, hugging, looking into the eyes of their parents because sheriffs around the country have gotten rid of in-person visits because the private equity industry owns the prison and jail telecom monopolies. And they've, over the last 10 or 15 years, the contracts have started to pay the sheriffs kickbacks to, if you basically get rid of visits, people are going to be forced to spend more money on phone and video calling in the jails and will make a lot of money, right? So like the prison and jail telecom industry, the commissary, so all of the they're such horrible places that they don't provide a lot of the basic necessities, so you have to pay for them when you're in there, and that's a multi-billion-dollar industry. Soap, toilet paper, toothpaste, food, sales, right? Now there's tablets if you want to rent a movie. A lot of the mail has been digitized, so you can't even send letters and photos to your loved ones anymore. You have to pay for services and mail. Anyway, medical care. It's one of the darkest corners of our society is the prison medical care industry. Anyway, I could go on and on and on, but it's not just prisons, right? As I mentioned a few minutes ago, we have a multi-billion-dollar pretrial money bail industry, almost unheard of anywhere else in the world. So these companies are actually the ones deciding whether you can pay for your liberty before you're even convicted of anything, even though you're supposed to be presumed innocent. Then there's huge contracts with police. I mean, tens of billions of dollars from the biggest companies in our society, Microsoft, Amazon, Axon, for big data, facial recognition, voice recognition, predictive policing algorithms, huge databases, cloud storage. Then all the court system software contracts, billions and billions of dollars more for courts and prosecutors. Huge business. There's a lot of people whose investments and whose livelihood depend on this system not shrinking. And so I could go on and on and on, right? Obviously, there's people that build the jails, or there's billions in construction contracts. There's people who make the tasers and the handcuffs and the guns and the uniforms. So anyway, these to say this is a conspiracy is almost a little bit misleading, just because the colloquial understanding of that term suggests some kind of like secret. But really, this of course is a conspiracy in the sense, in the sort of dictionary definition of that term and the legal definition of that term, which is just multiple people coming together and agreeing on a purpose and engaging in an overt act in furtherance of that purpose. That's just what a conspiracy means. So of course, there are numerous conspiracies, many of which are actually just out in the open. Obviously, there's a lot of secret bad stuff going on too, but much of this stuff is just totally out in the open. And there's just no accountability for the ways in which these practices deviate from fundamental constitutional law, but also a lot of it is totally legal in our society now too. So these are open and obvious conspiracies by people who are benefiting a great deal from how this system looks. And so I think it's both a constellation of conspiracies, and also it's fundamental to when you have a very, very unequal society with a small-ish number of people who own a lot of things. Those people are going to try to find ways to use the power of the state to preserve their own wealth and power. That's why for just to take one of many examples, in most major US cities, the patterns of policing do not track patterns of violent crime. They track the interests of real estate developers and other entities. So, like, it is the way it's structured, but that's also consistent with there being a lot of sort of conspiracies to use the state violence and surveillance and power to benefit people.
Hmm. You mentioned a moment ago that many of these systems are unconstitutional, but that reminded me, in your book, you also point out that the Constitution wasn't written with mass incarceration in mind. And I wondered if you could expand a little on that. And then I'm also curious, I haven't heard many arguments that center the Constitution when you're talking against the punishment bureaucracy as a whole. So I'm curious how receptive people have been to that argument, that line of thinking.
Well, I think that the Constitution is a fraught topic. Obviously, it was created a long time ago with very different kinds of interests in mind, and there's a lot of debate and discussion over how relevant it is or should be. But I think I wanted to just say, even for those people who are very interested in and concerned about the U.S. Constitution and who are, really supportive of it being a relevant document now. And of course, like, I'm not taking any position on that in the book or in this conversation, and most of my career is as a constitutional civil rights lawyer. So I think about the Constitution a lot, and I invoke it a lot in court to try to reduce the harms that people are experiencing, to try to get people and their families reunited, and to try to in some small way push back against the brutality of what these systems are doing. But when I invoke it here, I'm really just saying, if you're one of those people that puts a lot of weight in the Constitution, that document reflects, at least textually, and sort of in the way it's been interpreted in major cases throughout modern constitutional history, it puts a great deal of emphasis on fundamental rights like bodily liberty, like the ability to associate with your immediate family. These are principles in the constitutional tradition that are completely and utterly inconsistent with how contemporary government functions. So I'll just give you one example. The Constitution provides pretty robust rights against search without probable cause. But that does not mean that there are not millions and millions and millions of times every year that the police seize and search someone or even arrest them without probable cause. The Constitution is not self-executing. Similarly, the Constitution protects, it guarantees people a right to a trial by jury. And it says in the major Supreme Court cases that you can't waive your important constitutional rights, like trial by jury, unless it's knowing, intelligent, and voluntary. And yet, because we arrest so many millions of people, more people than any society in the recorded history of the modern world has ever tried to arrest, the entire system would break if those people exercised their right to a trial by jury. If they had to give them all lawyers and investigators, and they could file motions, and they could fight their case, and they have to impanel juries, we'd have to impanel millions and millions and millions of juries. The whole society would shut down. So what did they do? They permitted something called plea bargaining, which is flagrantly unconstitutional under any understanding, right? Basically happens with plea bargaining is the government is charging so many people with so many low-level crimes because the ruling class interests, respond to every social problem in our society or perceived social problem with increased repression. They're charging so many people that they couldn't possibly try them, and so they come to you and they say, you better plead guilty or you're going to be spending, this extra amount of time in a cage. And so for any individual, it's going to be in their interest, probably, to plead guilty if they can't get their case dismissed, right? So what ends up happening is the system, and many times if people call the state's bluff and go to trial, the state will just dismiss their case because it can't possibly prosecute that many people. We saw that with some of our bail cases. Once people started getting released from jail because we struck down as unconstitutional the ability to detain people just because they're poor, all these people were out of jail, and the leverage the government had over them to get them to plead guilty went away. And so they all started saying, well, I want to actually make you prove it. I'm not guilty. I want to fight my case in court. And so what we've seen is in these places we've done this, they start having to dismiss the majority of cases. They simply can't go forward with them.
Hmm.
But if of the cases that result in convictions around the country, 97 to 98, 99% in some places are guilty pleas. These are people who are waiving their rights. And when I say it's not consistent with the Constitution, I mean this. Nobody in ordinary parlance would say that if somebody comes to you, let's say I want to go out on a date with someone, and I go to them and I say, I'd love to take you out on a date. And they say, well, I don't really want to do that. And I say, okay, well, if you don't say yes, I'm going to put you in a cage for a year. Right? Nobody would, and then they agree to go on a date with me. Nobody would say that it's a voluntary decision in any meaningful understanding of that term. But that's how most criminal convictions are secured in the United States. People are coerced into waiving their rights because they're threatened with dire consequences, separation from their children, being thrown in a cage, et cetera, et cetera. And so that all I'm saying when I'm talking about the Constitution is that these topics are basically ignored in polite society. Everyone just goes along with it, even though they're totally inconsistent with our own understanding of how these systems are supposed to operate.
Yeah. I'm ignorant on this topic. Has there been a challenge at the Supreme Court level to the plea bargaining as a practice?
That is a complicated question. In classic lawyer fashion, I will say yes and no. But I think the most important thing to say is basically yes. The Supreme Court has blessed this system, even though there's really never been a serious attempt at the Supreme Court to grapple with how inconsistent plea bargaining is with their other fundamental jurisprudence, which says that any waiver of any constitutional right has to be knowing, intelligent, and voluntary.
Well, I guess that's a space I'll be watching. Hopefully somebody brings the case. I want to
Well, that's the thing. Like
yeah.
one of the things I want to say about Copaganda and this propaganda around these systems more generally is like that case would fail because the whole system would break. And so one of the big lies is that about how these systems are talked about in the news is that, and this is something I talk about much more in my first book, Usual Cruelty, where I really explain to people how the system actually works. One of the big lies is basically that like these decisions are being made based on like a good faith application of the rule of law and legal principles. Whereas what's really going on is the outcome is kind of preordained in a lot of these really big cases. Like everyone knows the system would totally fail without plea bargaining. And so the court has found and is going to find ways of justifying that system, despite the fact that nobody actually thinks it's consistent with legal principles. So when you say you want someone to bring that case, I would caution that, it's likely that the courts would find a way to preserve business as usual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I want to come maybe later in our conversation toward some remedies for this, but first I want to talk about some more current events, if that's okay. You write in Copaganda about the history of the conversation around police-worn body cameras, which are so often put up as a remedy in the immediate aftermath of any kind of spotlight on police conduct and misconduct. And so often, as I said at the beginning of our conversation, it seems like otherwise well-intentioned people find themselves advocating for body cameras and police training. I wanted to see if you had anything to say about that, but also we've now seen the emergence of smartphones with, cameras obviously in the hands of police and specifically in the hands of ICE. That seems like a newer development. I wondered if you knew about that practice before we all started paying attention to it in Minneapolis and how that relates to body cameras.
There's a lot to say about body cameras. I think it's probably the most successful achievement in modern propaganda. I've written a whole separate article called The Body Camera, The Language of Our Dreams, which goes into this in a lot more detail because I think it's so important to understand how liberals and progressives were brought to the moment where they then insisted on funding the greatest expansion of police surveillance industry and capacity in modern world history. I just want to, I'll just say a couple of quick things here. I encourage people to read the book Copaganda and also my separate article just on the history of body camera propaganda in the mainstream news, because there's so many nuances and points that you absolutely have to understand if you're going to understand this current moment where the Democratic Party are knowingly pushing completely meaningless reforms. And in some cases, like body cameras, actively harmful reforms that are going to give ICE more surveillance capacity as the solution to problems that have nothing to do with body cameras. But let me just say, first, you have to know the history. For many years, the police and the policing industry were desperate to get body cameras. They wanted them so badly, but they couldn't get the billions of dollars it was going to take to outfit every cop in the US with a mobile surveillance camera the cops control. And by the way, side note, the cops can edit and selectively release into the public or hide, right? And it wasn't just cops. In fact, the group that wanted them the most was probably prosecutors, because everybody understood that, as I said a minute ago, they have no capacity to process the millions of people that they arrest. Prosecutors are completely overwhelmed if they have to go to trial in all these cases. So they wanted body cameras because it was quick, easy leverage and evidence to be used against the poorest people in our society for the lowest level crimes. They all knew that nobody would really ever use them against cops, but they would be used against unhoused people for trespassing or people accused of possessing drugs, which are some of the most common offenses in the United States. So they thought if we could get this really strong evidence, we can come to them and we have more leverage, and we can say, look, you don't want to fight your case because we've got you on video trespassing here. So there's no point in you pursuing your rights to a jury trial here. And they would have more leverage to get a fine or other money that would then go back into their system and the budget, or more sort of higher likelihood of a jail sentence, so they could coerce them into a plea faster. So all these people wanted them. They just didn't have the money for them. And then after the killing of Michael Brown in 2014, the industry had a brilliant idea. And they thought, instead of portraying this as something that's good for the cops and that they all want, and it's good for prosecutors, let's capitalize on all this liberal and progressive outrage and pitch body cameras as a tool of quote unquote accountability and transparency. And that, Obama came in with hundreds of millions of dollar proposal for body cameras. All these local progressive mayors and governors and city council people started demanding them, right? It was a hugely successful PR campaign. And one of the big lies at the core of it was that body cameras, were about police misconduct. And there's a scientific consensus, even the federal government has this position because the evidence is so strong, that body cameras actually just don't make the police less violent. They just don't reduce police misconduct at all. So it's kind of like people are just pushing this like climate science denial. I mean, nobody involved actually thinks body cameras are a tool of police accountability or transparency. For all the reasons I discuss in the book and the articles, it's a huge lie. And the big kicker is that all these companies and the police themselves have been really focused on multi-billion-dollar perpetual contract profits to link body cameras to facial and voice recognition and big data databases, and that's why you see ICE bringing their own cameras to protests, to communities. They gleefully want as many faces as possible captured so they can add them to these databases, so they can train the algorithms, so they can track people, right? And there's all these stories about people being stopped by ICE, and then, for example, their global entry or TSA pre-check is then removed, or their home is raided, or their other consequences are visited upon them or their families, and that's all made possible by the integration of the cameras with the big data surveillance contracts. So anyway, that's the history of these things. And the other big thing is that these agencies, this is why you see ICE with their own cameras that they're bringing, or the Border Patrol, or you saw them bringing their own videographers along with them to create their own propaganda for their own right-wing base, right? They love the idea of catching this stuff on film, and so we saw that, in particular with like some of the initial surges in Los Angeles and Chicago, et cetera. The other thing is that they have such huge, police in general, we have a whole chapter on this in the book as well, have such big PR departments that they want to create a situation where they can control virality on social media and the news. So if something happens that they want to get out there, like let's say an undocumented immigrant is caught on video committing an assault, that's like out on Fox News and the New York Post within a few hours. It's getting millions and millions of views. Whereas if a camera captures the police committing some kind of misconduct, it's delayed for days or weeks, if it's even ever released. And in that way, you can kind of control virality, which is kind of everything in the modern information ecosystem. Like if something doesn't go viral, then it's almost like it didn't happen, And that controlling virality and the ability to edit the videos before they're released is why the police and ICE much prefer their own videos to, ordinary people with smartphones. And that's why you see a lot of the violence that ICE is committing around the country, targeting people who have their own smartphones who are recording them. The other thing I'll just point out really quickly is that you have to understand that the technology, body cameras do not record the officer. They look outward, away from the officer, toward you. It's no coincidence that like the definitive footage in like the George Floyd case or Eric Garner or Tyree Nichols in Memphis, right, are captured away from the officers, so you can actually see the whole interaction and see what the officers are doing. Whereas the videos that are produced by the officers themselves tend to look more chaotic and hectic, and they kind of justify, because they're also affixed to a chest, they're not like steadily held, right? They tend to make the scenes look more chaotic, which is part of the police justification. Well, we had to act, we had to shoot this person because things are moving so fast, and and it also enables officers to implement this training. I don't know if you've ever seen these videos where, as their body camera is up against you and it's kind of recording you, in the background, the officers are saying things like stop resisting, stop resisting. It enables them to kind of create a contemporaneous narrative that like the situation was tense and chaotic and out of control. And all of this is just training. So it's just a way for them to kind of manipulate reality.
Yeah, it's stagecraft for sure. Besides, well, as we think about the National Guard and ICE and other various policing forces surging into cities over the last few months, besides the use of their own personal cell phone cameras to supplement where they don't have body cameras, have you seen any other significant new tools or tactics in the arsenal of Copaganda emerge in the last couple of weeks or months?
Well, I don't know if there's anything new. I mean, and I'm not, a scholar or historian, maybe even capable of declaring what's new and what's not. But I'll just say what we're seeing now, I think the most salient thing about what we're seeing now to me is we have achieved a moment of consciousness about ICE. That, the killing of Renee Good and the killing of Alex Pretty and all of these shootings and all of the just brutality against protesters and the kind of just ghoulish behavior has created an international, and particularly and domestic, level of awareness and consciousness and outrage about what they're doing. So we're seeing the kind of liberal establishment implement almost all of the tactics that I discuss in my book that they implemented in the wake of the 2020 uprisings. or the 2014 uprisings, or indeed any moment of popular consciousness about police, where they're doing the whole bad apple thing. So they're trying to portray ICE and individual ICE agents, but then more generally ICE itself and CBP as kind of rogue, right? As somehow different from the policing uh, industry and from local police, right? Um, and they're sort of portraying um, fake solutions like body cameras, right? Or Hakeem Jeffries keeps going on and on about how we need a rule that they can't deport Americans. It's like, well, a lot of these things are already the law, like,
Yeah.
um, so I think that like what we're seeing is a attempt to portray the problems as a lot less structural and a lot less fundamental than they are, to kind of lie about the underlying goals and functions, to obscure how it's the same companies and the same training and the same practices are happening with ICE and with local sheriffs and police. There is no, you cannot talk about these things as if they're different from or separate from each other. So I think that's a big thing we're seeing is and we saw it in 2014 where despite the fact that Ferguson was doing essentially what all the other police departments around the country were doing, there was an attempt to scapegoat the Ferguson Police Department. An LAPD Rampart scandal, there was an attempt to scapegoat the LAPD, saying what they're doing is somehow different from the Chicago PD or the Detroit PD, or right? All of that stuff is nonsense. I mean, all of the major U.S. police departments function in essentially the same way. They have similar policies, they have similar demographic data, they have similar political spending, they have similar public relations strategies, they have almost identical numbers in terms of the kinds of offenses they ignore and the kinds of offenses they focus on. So we're losing the forest to the trees a little bit. And then there's this attempt both by Democrats and sort of mainstream news to like portray ICE as somehow specially bad. And not that, I mean, obviously it's horrific what we're seeing with ICE, but to sort of obscure the similarities between ICE and what local police are doing, and then also to sell people on nonsense reforms that, and I think this is the really most alarming and jarring thing. ICE's budget was record budget in 2024, and it was essentially tripled in 2025. So the detention budget for ICE alone in 2025 and for the next couple of years is like 62% greater than the entire Federal Bureau of Prisons. So what's being ignored in this discussion right now is all of this outrage over ICE is occurring before ICE has even touched the vast majority of their astronomical budget increase. They are going to have the funds, if they wanted to hire hundreds of thousands more agents. I mean, there's no parallel for it in modern world history. So the Democratic Party and pundits talking about like their major battle being to get them to wear body cameras at a time when we're talking about the largest investment in a Gestapo-like force in recorded world history, like it's laughable. So people are being totally misled to focus on all of the wrong things. And as a result, the major opposition party in the United States at a time of rising authoritarianism is not even demanding that we go back to even the record budget levels of 2024 for ICE. It's really shocking. And I think, to me, that regardless of what's new or not, that kind of pattern repeats itself anytime there's outrage over government repression, but it's particularly odious now because of the unprecedented stakes that we're facing as a society.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it felt like there was a moment of mass consciousness where a large number of Americans realized, well, it probably would be better if there wasn't an ICE. And I would have liked to see, opinion leaders push that consensus toward, well, it probably would be better if there wasn't a Department of Homeland Security. But instead, you have the elected Democrat leaders saying they can't wear masks. It's just ridiculous and depressing.
And it would be totally laughable in any other context. Like if you talk to even these mainstream Democrats, if you were to complain about the behavior of like the Russian security forces or something like that, you know, and you were to say to them, okay, well, what we're going to do is we're going to give the Russian security forces some more surveillance technology, and we're going to ask them to attend a few more training sessions, and that's going to solve the problems that are plaguing Russian dissidents, right? It would be laughable, and for some reason, like uh, the sort of liberal intellectual class, such as it is unable to apply the logic that they would apply in any other context to their own institutions.
Well, speaking of the liberal intellectual class, there was a big story this week. I think on the 11th of February, the New York Times reported that 2025 is shaping up to be the lowest year for recorded crime since 1900. And as soon as I read that, I thought of this upcoming conversation. I wonder if you could decode the propaganda in that news cycle.
So in 2020, there was a massive uprising around police violence. People started to ask really important, profound, deep questions about what are we getting as a society for all of this repression, brutality, family separation. And one of the main responses, which I document in the book with, I think, sometimes hilarious examples, it's important to try to be as funny as possible sometimes because the things we're talking about are so dark. So, I do poke fun at some of the reporting on this, and I give out lots of fake awards and stuff like that. But one of the main responses was this, that there's a crime wave, right? And it was this sort of incredible moment where every few weeks there was some new assertion that crime was out of control, and it was shoplifting, it was carjacking, it was murder, it was assault, and it was shootings, it was right. And what was a lot of it was just total lies, but in reality what happened was at some key points in the early pandemic there were some trends. Some types of crime went up in short periods. Some types of crime went down a little bit, but in general, the multi-decade trends were still the same, which is crime has been going down almost every single year. And I say crime, I mean police reported crime. I'm not talking about the crimes that police ignore, like wage theft and tax evasion and corporate pollution and sexual assault. Um, but the multi-decade trends were still the same. So um, throughout that entire period where there was this sort of epic moral panic about crime waves, crime was near historic 50, 60, 70-year lows. So yet every single one of these years in polling, people think crime is up. And that's an incredible achievement of propaganda. If reported crime can be at historic lows, with maybe like for a few months here and there, slight upticks in certain kinds of crime while other kinds of crime are going down. So, but like in general, the general trends have been very consistent for decades, including the last 5 years, last 6, 7, 8 years, 10 years, etc. Um, so I think it's not a surprise that 2025 is going to have historic lows. That's long-term trends that have absolutely, and this is the other point I want to make really clearly. These long-term crime trends have absolutely nothing to do with little tweaks in the policies of the punishment bureaucracy. They have nothing to do with whether there's 7 cops on this beat or 4, or whether the crime punishment for this crime is 8 years or 6.5, or whether this particular prosecutor is too progressive because they're only prosecuting 52% of cases, whereas their predecessor was prosecuting 57%. The scientific evidence is that these things have that people fight about a lot in the news. They have nothing to do with levels of crime. As I mentioned earlier, like we know that the structural features of society that determine how much people hurt each other, and they don't have anything to do with those things. They're deeper features of the political economy and culture of the society. So anyway, I think that's my main reaction is all of this stuff is just total nonsense. And one of the biggest lies in modern news is the lie that the little things we do in the criminal legal system have anything to do with big trends about public safety.
Right. Yeah. I did find it interesting in that New York Times coverage that they cited the phasing out of lead in paint or in gasoline, excuse me, beginning in the 70s as potentially contributing to this long-term trend. But at the same time, I've read enough of these coverage cycles. I won't be surprised if in 6 months, the New York Times is reporting on a spike in crime. Um, I have to say, reading your book, one does get the unfortunate impression that most reporters are really bad at their jobs or just ineffective at the job of reporting. And I have a lot of respect and appreciation for journalism, but that is the impression I get from all of these examples you cite. Do you have much faith in or hope for, let's say, some kind of improvement in the profession of journalism with respect to reporting on crime and safety and police, or are all the trend lines going in the wrong direction?
That's a hard question. I do have the last chapter in the book is an attempt at a more hopeful discussion about what we can all do, no matter what our skills and no matter what our experiences. So I'm not totally devoid of ideas for how we can make things better. And in fact, the only way I can go on every day, even doing the civil rights work that I do, is the idea that we are all, if we work strategically and if we work in solidarity with each other, we can of course improve the world as we know it. Having said that, I don't have a lot of faith in journalism fixing itself, especially if by journalism you mean mainstream corporate journalism. The political economic incentives of the large news organizations are completely antithetical to social justice and truth. So I think, it's not just that they're bad at their jobs. And I think there's a whole different, it's dangerous to paint with too broad of a brush because there's really different incentives at different levels of the news industry. And there's also different things going on with different people. So at the elitist organizations like New York Times, like people are much more aware of the propaganda role they're playing and much more intentional about it. Not all of them, but for the most part. Whereas like a lot of the lower level local news organizations, these are not super ambitious people that are attempting to cheat. There's just a different type of person attracted to that work, and a different mechanism of corporate decision making that decides which people are elevated. So once you get up to the levels of the New York Times or the NBC News or whatever, you know what's expected of you. You know what positions you're supposed to take. Nobody has to really even tell you anymore, kind of like which positions are safe, which of your positions are going to get more scrutiny, which reporting you can do without any scrutiny, really, right? Everyone understands it, and so there still is a lot of incompetent reporting. People are still quote unquote bad at their jobs, and I'm constantly having conversations with people where it's clear that they haven't really thought about what they were talking about. But there's I just want to say, like, there's some people who are more intentional, and then there's some people who are just kind of like ignorant a little bit, and then there's a lot of really amazing journalists who are trying under a system where investment in real journalism is dwindling, but they're doing a heroic job of trying to get basic facts into the public consciousness. So it's a spectrum, and I try to give advice and help, and we've also been building our own infrastructure to support really great journalism. But I don't think the answer is going to come from like the large corporate owned major news organizations, if that's what you're asking. And I think we have to build alternative systems of communities, developing their own information and awareness and knowledge about what's going on.
Hmm. Yeah, there do seem to be some good signs there. I mean, the way I see it, the like local but still corporate owned media, they just don't have the time. The newsrooms are getting too small. They're running from, one story to the next, and they may not be as intentional as you put it. with some of the errors in reporting on these topics. But then the large legacy national outlets, yeah, the incentive structures have co-opted them into the propaganda machine. But I do see good independent reporting on Substack. I see some small nonprofit newsrooms, and yeah, I think there are some reasons to be hopeful. On that note, I want to close by talking about that last chapter and things we can do, but also want to preface it with a bit of a personal anecdote. Listeners of this podcast will remember back in 2020, 21, when I was and others in Buffalo, where I live, Buffalo, New York, were involved in an effort to um, pick at one of so what we felt to be a low-hanging fruit of reform of our, criminal laws. We had used FOIA to get data from the local police on enforcement of open container laws, which are, as I'm sure you know, often used as a sort of premise for harassing people. And of course, the data which we mapped, by you mapped onto the Buffalo area showed that not only was the enforcement discriminatory by race, it was also only in certain neighborhoods. And there was a strong effort with a bunch of community partners just to try to get the council to remove this one law, which was rarely enforced, if ever. And we thought, could we just improve this in this small way? And it just sort of foundered. Nobody really offered a strong argument against it. The council just decided not to take it up. And that experience was, of course, dispiriting. And when you think, there's really very little I materially can do to, say, dismantle for-profit prisons, but there's also very little I can do in my own mid-sized city to get rid of a discriminatory law that isn't enforced. Well, as I said, get a bit dispirited. But you do close your book with really practical suggestions about where people could focus. And I wondered if you could share with listeners to the podcast what they might do and focus on now, whether it is in their own backyards or nationally or otherwise.
Well, I talk about a lot of different things in the end of the book, right? From lists of questions you can ask to local leaders to topics you can start looking into in your own communities, ways you can get involved with court watch, with participatory defense, where you work with families who are going through the system. Right, my own mother, when she retired, she became a court watcher, and she watches what happens in court and documents it as a sort of a individual, journalist working with other people, and they produce reports on what's going on, what the police, prosecutors, and judges are doing, and that can lead to huge and important information becoming very public, and it can lead to civil rights cases. It can lead to changes, and but most of all, it's a really radicalizing thing for a lot of people to actually go to court and see what's going on. But also, depending on what your skills are, there's so many different ways you can get involved as an artist, as a person who has family involved in the system, as a coder, as a teacher, as a public health worker. And I talk about all this at the end of the book. There's so many things you can get involved with in your own community, including just helping to create alternative programs, giving people rides to court, coming together other people to read books, to study together, to develop your own knowledge, to help implement programming at your local library. I mean, there's so many things that I go through that. So I think it's important to understand that starting with your own community and never trying to do anything alone. It's impossible to solve these problems alone. You have to get together with other people. You have to just start meeting with people and just doing stuff, even if it seems little, because it all will add up.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, I'll encourage people to read the book. We'll put a link in the show notes of the podcast, along with a link to your body camera article you mentioned. And I should say that all royalties from the book go to the Los Angeles Community Action Network and its Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. Before we close, is there anything else you'd like to mention, or anywhere else you'd point listeners for additional information?
That's it. I'm just really grateful to you for hosting me, and hope people enjoy the book. And we also have free books for anyone in prison, and also for teachers whose students can't afford it. So you always feel free to reach out to me if you think you might be interested in the free books.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Alec. It's been a pleasure.
Likewise.